We're sisters, best friends, and authors on a mission to help you stoke your creative fire and live the life of your dreams. We believe that purpose fuels passion and that creativity is your secret weapon for mass construction. There's never been a better time to bless the world with your dream realized. You're listening to The Kate and Abbie Show.
Hello, guys, and welcome to another episode of The Kate and Abbie Show. We're so glad to have you here. Thank you for listening today. We're going to be diving into some pretty exciting topics, and as promised last week, we have a special announcement at the end, so make sure you stick around for that. It's going to be fun. We hope you all are staying healthy and safe, and that you are going to gather some positive vibes from this episode of the show.
Yeah. It's going to be kind of a fun one.
Yeah.
More centered around like storytelling and writing, but it's going to be, I think, an entertaining listen and helpful for
anybody. Because we're all creative and we all love analyzing this stuff. Don't lie, you love it.
Yeah.
But especially if you're a storyteller, you're going to get a lot out of this one. So you're going to want a notebook and pencil or pen of choice to take notes, or take notes on your phone or something, because we're going to dive deep into some storytelling elements here. We're actually going to be discussing two films that are actually quite new releases. And we're going to be breaking down the storytelling elements in those. And the topic of today, the topic that we're breaking down specifically, is nonlinear timelines within stories. How they work, how they don't work, how we can use them in our writing and filmmaking, if you're writing a screenplay, and what can become confusing, what can make your story just awesome.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about all that.
I feel like this is kind of a popular topic. It's like not super popular, but I know I get quite a few questions from writers asking, how can I write flashbacks or a nonlinear timeline in a way that holds people's attention, holds your reader's attention or your viewer's attention, and isn't just confusing? Because we have all seen movies and read books where the timeline is just confusing and jarring, and that's kind of what we're going to explore in our examples today. And also we're going to explore nonlinear timelines done extremely well, and how that can be really impactful and just a very unique, creative way to tell a story, and actually a better way than linear sometimes, if you do it well. So we're going to discuss like how to do it well.
Right. So like we're going to look at some examples, which I love. Yes. Love examples, because it helps us to understand and wrap our heads around these concepts that otherwise sometimes feel kind of disembodied.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're going to dig into that today. So let's dive right in. We're first going to talk about the film, The Aeronauts.
This pressure is changing fast.
And so it begins.
Yeah, and this is a film that you watched it first. I didn't see it. It came out on Amazon Prime. When was that? Last year?
I think so. Yeah, I think it came out around Christmas, I want to say.
Yeah.
I am pretty sure it
And
did.
I was like, that looks good. Looks a little more action adventure. Then you watched it and you were like, we need to watch this together and discuss it.
Yeah.
And I thought it was I would say it was good.
Yeah.
After I finished watching it, I was like, that was good.
It was.
But there were a few things about the timeline I know that we both talked about.
Yeah.
That could have been better.
Right. First of all, like, just quick breakdown if you have no idea what the film is. It was done by, I think, Amazon Prime Original. And I was super attracted to it because of the great acting in it. Awesome acting. And it's about James Glacier and Amelia Wren and their balloon trip, which was a historical, and I'm kind of using loose terms here because I don't know a lot about like weather history, but it has a lot to do with the history of some of the first meteorologists that wanted to send a weather balloon up, and they believed, hey, we can predict the weather, and this was a time when everyone was like kind of laughing at that idea that you can't predict the weather. So it was like when the first meteorologists were born, and this we were following particularly James Glacier as he kind of fights for this idea that we can predict the weather and save lives by doing so. And so he wants to like go up in this weather balloon and like collect data and kind of disprove some of the doubt that's floating around this idea of weather prediction. And you're following almost just as much the pilot of the whole expedition, Amelia Wren, who is piloting the balloon and has a heap ton of really conflicted backstory that bring a lot of emotional baggage to the trip and whether or not she wants to do it. James also has his own emotional baggage of like self-doubt and wanting to prove himself. So these characters actually had a great, so there's a breakdown, first of all, if you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what the story's about. I thought both the characters had an enormous amount of really good internal conflict.
Yeah, I thought so too. And I was like, oh, the backstory here is really good. You know why they want what they want, why they're going after this goal, why they want to achieve this goal. You know what they're afraid of. You know what is driving them really to do everything that they do. But you don't find it out until later.
Much later. And that was one of the things when I first started watching the film. It took me 2 days to watch the film because I was also doing other stuff while I was watching it. So I fit it into my schedule over the course of 2 days. The first half of the film, when I first watched it, I was like, I'm not like fully into this. Because it felt like just more like almost watching a documentary of like a live action event that was happening. Like you're just seeing events unfold to two characters that I don't know anything about them at all. And so it's more like just like you spoke about recently in a few of your videos about how it's more like just the neurons firing the brain of your experiencing these high intensity action sequences that are happening to the characters, and you're like, kind of freaking out with them. But you don't know why it really particularly matters to James or Amelia until like, I think it's like at least halfway through the film.
Yeah.
The first hour of the film is mostly spent on the actual events that are happening in the balloon, because the movie begins with the balloon taking off.
Yeah.
And then the duration
with it landing. So we're like the duration of the whole trip, basically. But then in between, throughout the course of it, there's like all these flashbacks that are taking you back to the ground, really.
Right.
Back to a previous time in the character's past. Not very distant past. We didn't see like they're growing up or anything like that. But like a few years earlier, probably, is the farthest back flashbacks. Yeah. And I know that whoever edited it had the idea to make the flashbacks have widescreen bars on them, and the current day does not have widescreen bars. It's like full aspect ratio of your standard HD size,
right?
For those video nerds out there. But it was such a small detail that it did not, like you said, you didn't even notice it when you first watched it.
Right, I didn't notice it at all. I think I
only noticed it because
Abby pointed it. She's like, "Oh, look, the widescreen bars go away when the memory stops." I'm like, "Oh,
yeah." Oh, so I feel like not many people would have noticed that anyway.
Yeah, so it was a little confusing you kind of got it, like when it showed them on the ground. You're obviously like, "Okay, this happened at another time," because we know that they're up in a balloon.
Although the first time it happened, I'm like, "Oh, this could have been time went by, and now this is the future."
Right, I didn't. I wasn't sure either. Yeah. So they had. The concept was very artful of let's have the whole, like the movie begins with the balloon going up, the movie ends with the balloon coming down, and we'll learn about the backstory of each character and why these events matter to them as we go through the movie, through backstory flashbacks. But what I found confusing and not as engaging as it could have been, was the fact that we don't really find out why it really matters to them until a great deal of the way through the film. And we've already had to sit through about probably an hour-ish of the film before we even begin to find out, like, oh, I see why, okay, James has all these internal conflict about needing to prove himself to the world and to kind of like overcome all these doubts surrounding him from other people, the doubter voices in his head. And then we see that Amelia, the pilot, had backstory with a very traumatic life event that happened on her last balloon trip that she has severe PTSD from, and it altered the course of her entire life. So it's a very traumatic event for her to even be back in the balloon. That was a very important piece of information that would help us understand why she's reacting to everything that she's reacting to, but we don't find that out until almost practically the end of the movie.
Yeah, and also the thing that I thought was confusing, especially confusing, is when in the very first scene, basically, the opening scene, when they're about to take off in the balloon, you don't understand the relationship between these two characters, and there's like loads of backstory later that shows you what their relationship is like.
Which is actually quite a compelling, wonderfully done relationship. Very, very good.
Is so good. I loved it. But at the beginning, you don't know any of that. And so you're like, this guy seems like annoyed with this lady. Why is he like so annoyed? Does he not like her? Does she not like him? Like, what is going on here? Like, I was confused when I first saw it. And I was like, I wonder what their relationship is going to be, because they seem like kind of like they don't like each other, which wasn't the case at all. So it was like a little bit confusing. I mean, he was a little bit like, wow, she's over the top.
Do you take anything seriously, Miss Wren?
Some things.
That crowd gathered to witness us break the height record. They didn't need to see a flying dog.
Still stuck there, are you?
They needed each other. They were like codependent on each other to have this balloon ride be successful.
Right.
And then, like we were saying, in one of the pivotal moment scenes in the backstory is when Glacier approaches her at some ball, and he like asks her, basically that's the first time that he asks her to go on the expedition with him.
Miss Wren, sorry, I'm a scientist, an astronomer, and a meteorologist, and
Scientist, an astronomer, and a what?
I believe that the weather can be predicted. Miss Wren, I need to make studies of the air, and I need to be in the air, and I need you to help me.
Do you even have a balloon?
And seeing that scene after the fact takes like all of the suspense or intrigue out of it, because you already know that she goes.
Right.
So you're like, okay, yeah, she's gonna go, even though she's like, I don't know yet. And it would have made it like so much more intriguing and suspenseful to watch her struggle with the decision-making process.
Right.
In linear time.
And be suspense. It would create suspense of like, is she going to?
Right. But because we keep flashing back, it's like we already know that she does.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah. And there was such a volume of these flashbacks that I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong here, this is just a guesstimate, is it was almost like a 1-to-1 ratio of what was actually happening and also flashbacks.
It was at least a third.
I mean, you spent quite a bit of time.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So
it was at least a third of the movie.
Probably a third or more.
Honestly, if it was a third of the movie, it would have fit beautifully into a 3-act story structure, because it kind of already felt like it was a 3-act story structure, just non-linear.
Okay, so now if it was arranged as a 3-act story structure, like what would that look like? Like run through that.
So I would have the backstory, like the very first backstory where you are seeing what is the pivotal thing that happened in her past and his past, and where are they before all of this stuff happens to them. So that would be like the hook is the internal conflict. And I talk about that on my channel, is that the best kind of hook you can have is showing us the protagonist's internal conflict. And then starting from that place to going towards the inciting incident is what pushes you outside your comfort zone. So that would be the big question. I want to go up in the balloon. Glacier wants to go up in the balloon. And he goes and asks Amelia Wren. And that kind of pushes her outside her comfort zone.
Right.
And she has to make this
causes
decision.
her to face her impossible choice.
Right.
Which
leads to the impossible choice.
Right. Do I get back in the balloon, or do I let the trauma in my past keep me from doing that?
Right. Keep me on the ground.
Keep me on the ground.
And then the first plot point would have been when they leave.
Right.
Which would have been perfect, because then it opens right up into Act 2. Mm-hmm. And then even the first pinch point was in there, I think, with something happening. There are a few different little pinch points in there, but usually like any kind of little
what was the first pinch point
this could be dangerous later.
Right.
Pretty much everything. You're like, these people are
probably
gonna die.
there might be a thunderstorm later.
Yeah.
Nah.
Exactly. And so, like, just this general, like, these people are probably going to die in this balloon.
Right. Right.
Just impending doom, danger,
Right.
head, danger. But that would have been I think, a great first act. You could have done it all linearly and shown her decision-making process and then the impossible choice. And you would have cared so much more about the characters, I think, going into the whole perilous. And then the perilous events would have been that much more.
The rest of the movie.
Yeah, but it would have been that much more engaging, I think, and enthralling. And you would have been like, no, they can't die. Not because it's just like my mirror neurons are firing and I feel your pain because I'm a fellow human. It's like, I know this person and I can feel what it would feel like to be them.
Exactly.
And to have their hopes and fears and struggles.
Right. And you understand so much more why they're reacting to events the way they're reacting to them. Because it's not that you want the characters to be predictable to a point where it's boring, but you want them to be predictable to a point where the reader, the viewer, the person engaging with the story feels like a friendship basis. They feel connected to the main character and they're not constantly jarred by every decision the character's making because they don't know they're completely unpredictable and unconnected to the main character. And they're like, I don't understand why, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And it even puts like into context some of the decisions that they make later, like how Glacier's like, oh, we need to go higher, and doesn't really like know when to stop.
What have we to lose?
Our lives.
This could be more important than our lives.
Right.
But because Amelia's been up there before and she like knows things and has been through traumatic things and has just seen more of being a pilot than he has, she takes it more seriously. And so there's like this dichotomy going on.
Right.
It's kind of like little mini fight war between them of like, what should we do? And you see like the reasoning behind
And you see that her priority becomes preserving them because she lost someone. His priority is to kind of
prove himself, even if he dies trying.
Prove himself above all because he like values that so much because of how much doubt and criticism he's always been beaten over the head with his like whole life.
Right.
Or throughout the beginning of his career. So yeah, I feel like seeing that backstory would so help you to connect better with the characters. And then you could still have flashbacks taking place throughout the rest, such as representing Amelia's PTSD, representing some of the memories that Glacier has of being in meetings where he's getting torn apart. All those things could have still been kept in, and you could have had those artful cinematic flashbacks without it being like, oh, all of the backstory has to be flashbacks. Really hefty flashbacks that are hard to follow, and they won't come until so far into the story that we don't know for the first hour why these characters are even doing anything they're doing.
Yeah, like I would have kept a lot of her PTSD flashbacks as like flashbacks throughout the course of the film, because that would have been an accurate representation of trauma, I think, in that she really like could not forget about it. And she was having all of these triggers during their flight.
Which was, I think they represented really well,
Yeah, that felt very natural and realistic. But it almost made the PTSD flashbacks not as intense because they threw in these other random flashbacks to like, her talking to her sister in the past and, the other
it did take away from them a little bit because there was so much information that you were trying to process and piece together what it was.
Yeah, I think that if they had just kept the traumatic flashbacks, it would have actually highlighted her trauma more.
Yeah.
And then they could have done sort of the same thing a little bit with him, with flashing back to like all of the self-doubt moments, because that's what he would be kind of contemplating, and using the formula of like cause and effect, which I've talked about in a video about flashbacks before, is that everything works by cause and effect. And in order for a flashback to feel natural, there really has to be a cause to go to this flashback. Like there has to be a trigger in the present moment to go to this flashback. We have to know why we're entering the flashback.
Right, which I think they did that really well.
In which one?
For some of the Aeronauts. Some of the triggers were there.
Yeah, some of them were.
And then
the
other
first
ones,
one I think that he has was there, like when he sees a building.
Yeah, I did think that was cool.
I thought that was a good connection.
Right, because they're flying over a building. I think it's a building in a university he attended, I want to say. But I wasn't paying strictly close attention. And then suddenly it's like, oh, we're in a piece of backstory back when him and his buddy are climbing up on the roof of this building to watch somebody else launch a balloon. So that was cool. I thought like that some of the appropriate triggers were there, but some of them, it was like the backstory became so hefty that you lost sight of where we even left off.
Right. And also I feel like there wasn't like cues in, they could have created more cues for it to happen if they did want to do it nonlinear. Like when they're in the balloon together, they could have been talking about the past. And then like going into like, oh yeah, this one time that's just an example, but like referencing the past, and then we go back and we see it. Like that could have been another option. Because I know we're going to talk about something similar to that.
Because they actually did have a couple of conversations where they could have like slid the backstory in there, and then it was just like they didn't.
Yeah, they like didn't really talk about it much for the first half of it. Anyway.
Right, because they kind of finally talked about it with each other after you already knew about it, which was like almost the end of the film.
Right.
And then the characters began to talk about it. But if you flipped it on its head and had all the backstory up front, or at least 85% of the backstory up front, we would be like cheering these characters on and hardcore rooting for them, because we would know like all the baggage they're bringing to this balloon trip. And it's not just like, oh, look, really aesthetic footage of Felicity Jones and Eddie, what's his last name? I always forget.
Redmayne.
Eddie Redmayne and Felicity Jones in a really awesome CGI hot air balloon.
Yeah.
It would mean more to us to understand, oh, wow, okay, this means so much, and I understand a little bit of James Glacier's character, I understand a little bit of Amelia Wren's character, and I understand why this balloon trip is, the gravity of this balloon trip.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And why it matters.
So, I think the one merit that it did have going for it, which the other example we're going to talk about in a minute does not have this, is the flashbacks were at least done in a linear fashion.
Yeah.
So that you could follow them. So it was like when we flashed back, we went to like the first flashback, and then the flashbacks were in kind of a linear progression leading up to where we started the movie. So we could kind of easily wrap our heads around like, oh, okay, yep, I understand like the progression of that.
So in contrast to that, the other example that we were discussing earlier of a great example of flashbacks in a story.
Done in the exact structure we just discussed.
Is Amazing Grace. And I can't remember what year that came out. Do you remember?
It was like 2005 or 6 or something.
Yeah, it was back there. I mean, it's always like weirds me out when I think like that was 15 years ago.
Yeah, like I remember when it first came out. It's like, but
I can't remember. I can't believe Pride and Prejudice came out 15 years ago.
That's insane.
What the heck? But Amazing Grace with Jan Gruffudd. And Benedict Cumberbatch. I mean, like, name a more iconic duo. I'll wait.
Yeah. And if you don't know anything about the story Amazing Grace, it's following William Wilberforce, and the group of people surrounding him, too many to name, amazing people who fought for the abolition of the slave trade in England circa late 1700s, I believe.
I believe so.
I'm not.
It was 1800s. I can't remember.
I'm not
exactly.
a date person.
Yeah, me neither.
But incredible story, really amazing, and it deserves to be watched by everyone. One of my favorite films of all time.
Yeah, same. It's just superb acting, superb storytelling. It's just so great. The writing is amazing. Everything about it, but specifically what we're thinking about right now is the flashbacks, because it is told in a nonlinear timeline, and it does it so well. So the first scene that you see, it opens with a quite future William Wilberforce, and he's going to his friend's house, right?
His
or is he related?
cousin's.
Cousin?
Yes.
His cousin's house, and you can see that he's been through a lot. He has an illness, a serious illness, and he's just is very worn out from the fight that he's been in for many years, fighting for the abolition of the slave trade in England. And it goes, so it follows him for like, I can't even remember, like, what, the first 10 minutes or something, and then it starts to go back into flashbacks.
Right.
I actually really want to rewatch it now.
Yeah, me too. So I mean, like the Aeronauts, how it starts with like, okay, the event that's happening like way later on in comparison to all the backstory, same things happening here. We're starting at, he's already been through a really ragged fight and we're way deep in already, but now through certain triggers, we're going to go back over the backstory, and it's going to happen probably, I would have to look on the film itself to see how deep in, but I swear it's not more than like 10 minutes into the film that we're starting to dig into, okay, how did he get from where he began to where he is now?
Yeah, and also the first flashback we get, I think it says like 10 years earlier or something. It gives a timestamp, which is really helpful because then we know when we go back, this is where we are. This is how many years ago it was. But like you said, the most important thing is the triggers. And so like we were just talking about with the Aeronauts, is that there has to be those triggers. And in Amazing Grace, I feel like the triggers are so good because there are a few triggers with just like general trauma and like him having nightmares and stuff like that, that he remembers these things. But also when he meets Barbara Spooner, who's
also,
going to be
like, not to interrupt, but like awesome representation of very accurate representation of like how he experiences PTSD,
right,
and the trauma of everything he's experienced and gone through with so many people he cares about. Like the triggers were just so realistic and made you just so like feel the trauma he was feeling. Like,
can you dilute what I feel? You've given your youth and your health for this cause.
Yeah, I agree.
And then 100%. The way they used
the acting
it to,
is great too.
Yeah,
like,
and the way they used that to lead into the story behind the story behind it.
Yeah, and you can see how like another thing is that he like doesn't really like to talk about it, and so later when he does talk about it, you know, you kind of understand the significance of him talking about it. So one of the interesting lead-ins that they have to the backstory is his cousin and his cousin's wife trying to set him up with this woman, Barbara Spooner, who they think would be a great girl for him. And he's like, I'm not interested in getting married. But they meet by chance and they end up talking, and she's actually an abolitionist herself. And so they start talking about what he's been through, and he starts to tell her his backstory. And so through this storytelling, really, we're able to flash back, and we still flash forward to the present time, but because it's through his narrative, it just makes it feel so much more natural, and you also like understand why we're going back, and also gives us a little bit of a chance to see it from Barbara's point of view, in a way, and from his point of view. But there's like that trigger, the very obvious cause and effect, like, okay, we're hearing about this now because he's telling her about it.
Exactly. Yeah, it was very artfully done. So then we see, like, we get a huge piece of backstory at this certain point in the film where he finally starts unloading his backstory to Barbara, where we see a giant part of, okay, now we're kind of all caught up.
Yeah.
But the progression of the backstory and how it's fed to us as the viewer feels very natural and not displacing at all.
Yeah, and it's very engaging, too.
Yeah. Very.
It's never like, oh, I already know what's going to happen here. You don't really know what's going to happen in his past. Like, you know that he has not been necessarily victorious in the way that he has wanted to be, but you don't really know exactly what happened in the past. And so there's that intrigue of like, I wonder what it is that has happened that has led him to this moment.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think it was just so well done. The pacing was, just felt so natural.
Mm-hmm. So so the way that they did the flashbacks in the Aeronauts versus Amazing Grace, I feel like the biggest differences there are in the Aeronauts, it was flashing back with no obvious triggers to moments in the past. And even though those moments in the past were presented in a linear timeline, it was so broken up and so delivered so late into the film that it really took away a lot of the emotion and the connection that we felt to the protagonists. And if it had been linear, or if the triggers had happened sooner and we'd been given more backstory sooner, we would have cared more about the characters. Versus in Amazing Grace, they did a really good job of inserting the flashbacks in a way that felt natural, with triggers that also felt really natural. So you have this natural cause and effect, as well as showing us why what's happening in the present moment matters to the characters, but not waiting a long time to show us that. So I think that's one of the things that we first mentioned about it, was that it's like the first 10 minutes you immediately start to enter the flashbacks, and you're told this was X amount of years ago. So you have some yardstick to measure all of this by, and I think you get a lot more emotion and connection to the characters in Amazing Grace.
I agree. And I think it has to do with the fact that you care about them earlier on in the story.
It doesn't waste any time with letting you see what happened in the past and why it matters today.
All right, like I was literally thinking, if you took an edit of the Aeronauts, took all the backstory and like smushed it together at the front, and then
see that
had it, like, I would really be super compelled, because everything else about the film was quite good. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Someone should make an edit like that. I would not mind seeing that. So do you want to jump into the next side-by-side example here? We're going to start with the I won't say bad example, but just the example that could have been done in a more coherent, engaging way. And this is definitely something that a lot of people have heard of. Probably you've heard of it if you're listening to this right now, because it's been widely popular lately. And that is the new adaptation of Little Women.
I'm working on a novel. It is a story of my life and my sister's.
So Little Women 2020 just came out recently. And we just watched it very recently because we didn't make it to the movie theater before the quarantine happened. So we watched it in our own home. And this is a film that was completely nonlinear in timeline, but beyond being nonlinear in the current day, what's happening, we're flashing back to nonlinear flashbacks. So it was very, very confusing, I thought.
Yeah, well,
and
I think
jarring?
It starts out linear, but actually,
but it starts
you're right,
in like
it doesn't.
The very future, like far future.
Yeah, they start in the far future, and then like it's funny because I'm trying to even think of how to describe the way they did the flashbacks, and my brain is already confused.
I know. Like
they
it wasn't the
at a
last
far
scene
future
that
event.
they started at, but it was very
very
close to
deep
the
into the
scene.
story when Joe is already at the boarding house in New York City, which is, you've read the book. I mean, that's quite a ways in.
Yeah.
And then we're going to go back over everything that happened from page 1 by inserting flashbacks at random in a non-linear fashion.
Yeah, and there were also no clear triggers for the flashbacks either.
Right.
And the way that it was following Joe and Amy, like basically in tandem. I felt like they both had the same amount of screen time. And you didn't know, if you didn't know the story of Little Women, and if you never saw any other adaptation, which I feel like quite a few people have not seen any other adaptation except the one that just came out, and maybe a lot of people haven't read it either, if you aren't acquainted with these characters in the story already, like, it would be very confusing to understand how the characters that we're bouncing around between are related to each other.
Yes.
Not just like blood related, but like related. How are their lives related? Because they're all in different locations.
I was also unclear on if I, like, okay, so Abby and I have watched almost every adaptation of Little Women.
Except for like the old black and white adaptations.
Multiple times, basically, since we were children.
Yeah.
And Abby's also read the book. Yeah. So we've watched and absorbed like many times a lot of different adaptations of this. But if I didn't know anything about the story, I would be confused also on like at the beginning who is related to who.
Right.
And how is everyone connected? Because that was quite unclear.
Yeah.
For like a little moment there, for sure.
Yeah, and how the beginning we're flashing between Joe and Amy, and at home we're going back to Meg, I think.
Yeah.
For like a little bit of it, but not much. We don't see very much with her. But how it would go back to the past in a way that kind of felt like the structure just to me felt like they didn't really know where to put the flashbacks, and so just kind of sprinkled them in, not really in any significant pattern or way. And also all of the flashbacks, I felt like there were probably too many of them for an average length film, and because of that, they felt kind of shortened. Like, I felt like every single flashback felt almost too short. Like, the scene, like, we were trying to include the significance of the scene, but because it had to fit into this time constraint, it almost felt, like, shortened and therefore kind of lacked the emotional punch that it could have had.
Right. Because a lot of the behaviors that are taking place when the movie opens, such as how the sisters are very emotionally distraught over Beth being unwell. We don't even understand their relationship yet. We don't know that they care very much about each other. We don't really know how close knit their family is. So we can't really identify that anything as more than beyond like a general concern. And then the interactions between Amy and Laurie, Amy being upset by the immature behaviors that Laurie exhibits.
Right.
We don't have any basis for how Laurie acts normally yet.
Exactly.
We don't even know how Amy acts normally yet.
Yeah.
So we can't really account for why she's responding to him in the way that she is responding to him.
I despise you.
Why do you despise me?
Because with every
And we
chance
can't
of
account
being
for the way
good,
that he's
happy, and
behaving.
useful.
Because we
Yeah.
don't know anything about who they are as characters, which we learned in the backstory, but the backstory, again, comes in such a kind of disheveled manner that we have a hard time piecing it together. At least I did personally.
Yeah, me too. And another thing that I think is kind of it kind of took away from it is that it spoils a lot of what you're going to see in the flashbacks, like how we're currently, and I also feel like it feels weird because you just reminded me that we enter the story in the beginning right before Joe goes back home from New York to see Beth because Beth is ill. But then we go back into flashbacks, like at random moments, but then we eventually return to the present time and then we go forward. So it's like going in all these different directions.
And like
in time.
Yes.
Again, if you had done it in a linear fashion, even if you didn't lengthen the scenes, because I completely understand the constraint of a screenplay, because you need it to be a certain number of pages, you need to be a certain runtime in order to get into movie theaters, obviously. But even if you hadn't lengthened the flashbacks and just done it in a linear timeline, it would have given a completely different feel. You would have cared so much more for the characters. And it wouldn't have even had to be the whole thing was linear. Like we said with the Aeronauts, you could have done a little bit more flashbacks in there without having like the entire thing be this jarring back and forth. I don't really know what time I'm in, especially since the characters, like their appearance kind of never changed, except Amy did her hair differently.
Yes, that was I found
so there was no
the
indication
most
of where you
confusing
were.
was I was constantly trying to figure out whether I was watching something that was taking place in the present day, which I was already unsure when the present day was.
Yeah.
Or if it was a flashback to a different time.
Yeah. And
constantly throughout the whole film. I was just like, is this present? Like I even said to Abby, which if you've, anyone who's watched films with Abby and I know that we're notorious for talking throughout a film. And I'm like, is this present? Is this present? And it was hard to tell.
Yeah, it was. I was going to say earlier that I lost my train of thought earlier, but
I was just going to add, like, the best way I can describe it, and I don't mean this in a rude way at all, but it felt like Little Women pulsed in a blender.
Yes.
Because it felt like, wait, where was this part?
Or
and
like
where
I said,
was this supposed
if
to
you
come in?
like took the book and like took out the binding of it and just threw the pages in the air and then scooped them up into one pile and then read it in that order. That's kind of how it felt to watch it.
It did.
Like, it's same source material, but just completely disheveled, like you said.
Yeah.
And another thing I was going to point out was, like, it kind of spoiled things for the future. Like, in the beginning, when you immediately learn, almost like 10 minutes into it, I think, that Laurie is in Europe because he's upset because Joe turned him down.
I couldn't believe Joe turned you down. I'm so sorry.
Don't be, Amy. I'm not.
So now we already know that.
And you're like, oh, okay, spoiler alert.
Right. So
That's going to happen eventually in the flashbacks. And so you're kind of, I wouldn't say that it creates suspense. It creates like sort of this, like, oh, I know what's going to happen there.
Right. Well, also the fact that, I mean, the events that take place aren't really suspenseful events. Like you like you know what I mean? Like, if you find out what you do, like, really early on, like almost the first scene that Meg marries John.
Yeah, that's another thing.
That doesn't necessarily make me feel suspense for like, oh, I wonder when that's gonna happen.
You see him in a flashback,
okay.
and you're like, oh, there's that guy she's gonna marry.
You're kind of just like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
The next thing.
I felt like Meg's character was very underdeveloped too.
Right. I felt like because and now like we totally get here. The film had some merits to it. There were some really cool sequences with the choreography. I think of the scene with Joe and Laurie dancing on the porch. Loved that scene. Mm-hmm. Also a really great scene between Amy and Laurie that I thought was extremely well done. So it had merits, and if you've never seen Little Women, watch all of the adaptations.
Yeah, it's good to compare them all.
Yeah, compare them and see the differences in storytelling. That's really what this is, an invitation to like look at the differences in storytelling. I just felt like this adaptation, although it had some really interesting angles and choreography and etc., but it made the story feel incoherent.
You just didn't care about the characters.
Right.
And
you
to
really
me, it's
didn't.
Like, you have to care about the characters.
You have to know why any of this matters to them, and you need to know why do I care about them? How do I feel connected to them?
And honestly, like, so many of the scenes, I'm like, this is actually, like, there were a few scenes that I'm like, this is a well-written scene. And this could have been really powerful if I had seen some of the characters' backstory. Like, I'm particularly thinking of the scene where Professor Bear talks to Joe about her writing, and she's getting all upset about it, about his opinions on it.
Joe, to talk about your work.
And who made you high priest of what's good and what's bad? Huh?
And you don't really know why any of this emotion is being summoned in her because you haven't really seen, like, why this matters to her, you know? And there are a lot of scenes like that, I felt, that you needed something before it to give this scene context. You needed the yardstick that this scene gave you in the past to measure the importance of what's happening now. And you don't have the yardstick, so you're just like, okay, I'm watching this scene, and I don't really know who these people are or why what's happening matters to them.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I think we've been kind of hammering home the point is that you have to have that yardstick. You have to have some kind of measuring device that shows you why what's happening matters to the characters. Right. Otherwise, it's just stuff happening.
Exactly.
It's just plot driven.
Now, if you took the movie,
not saying it won't be entertaining, because if you have a beautiful set design, beautiful costumes, which Little Women 2020 had, and if you have interesting editing, it will hold your attention. And it will entertain you, but it won't necessarily impact you as much as it could if it was character-driven and started from a place of seeing deep inside the emotions and the things that are important to these characters.
Right, which while we're on the topic of Little Women, I think it's would be good to add here that our favorite adaptation of Little Women, which of course it's hard to compare to the 2020 version because it is being squeezed into the confines of a feature-length film, and this is a mini-series.
Although it's only 3 hours.
Right.
Because there's only 3 episodes.
That much longer. But, that's a good point. That's worth noting for sure. Little Women BBC mini-series version.
2018.
Absolutely breathtaking.
Beautiful.
And I feel like
So good, so good.
It's a lesser known, but the acting is just mind blowing. Some really well known actors that it just had an incredible cast. And if you have the time and desire to watch it, it's definitely worth watching a version of Little Women that spans 3 hours rather than like an hour and a half or however long.
I think it was 2 hours.
Was it
but
2 hours?
It felt squished.
It did feel quite squished. So watch the miniseries because it's
It's
not
incredible.
the cinematography itself deserves like awards. It's
It
so
does.
mind-boggling. The acting is so incredibly well done. The internal conflict I thought was really just it hit you right in the gut at so many turns.
Yeah, and it was told in a linear timeline, but it didn't have to give you like every single moment of their lives to make you care about them.
Right.
Like it still showed like, the pivotal moments that you see a lot of them in the new Little Women film, but it was delivered in a way that I think was more just, it made you care more about the characters. It was more intimate feeling.
Yes.
And less like, oh, here's a glimpse of this. Okay, next thing, here's a glimpse of this. Like,
Right.
it didn't feel rushed at all. And I feel like you mentioned, the cinematography is amazing. It's absolutely stunning. And it gives you a whole feeling, really.
Yeah, it does.
Like, even just the B-roll and the transition shots and the establishers. So good. Just all of it.
It's a visual feast.
It is.
It really is. So, I mean, I think for Little Women adaptations, there's definitely pros and cons of each that we've seen. But our favorite is for sure the BBC one. And the new 2020 version is the only version I've seen that has the layout is just so strangely disorganized feeling that it makes me feel detached. Even as someone who knows the story incredibly thoroughly, I was confused.
Yeah.
So there is that. On the flip side of that coin, we have another example of very similar structure, but done in a different way. Laid out in a different way. That was sort of, you almost feel was, as you watch Little Women 2020, was actually kind of the intention that the producers were trying to weave in there, but it didn't really work out, in my opinion.
Yes.
And then this is an example of that structure just done superbly.
Which is Mrs. Wilson, which is a BBC series that came out. Was it Masterpiece? I feel like it was Masterpiece?
It was Masterpiece.
Yeah, and that was, I think, 2019. So it's fairly new, and it follows the story. It's actually quite interesting because Ruth Wilson plays the lead, and it's actually based on a true story about her grandmother. And so Mrs. Wilson is a woman living in, I think, the 1950s, was it? 1950s London, and her husband is a writer, and he suddenly passes away at the very beginning of the series. And following his death, she begins to make some pretty shocking discoveries about him and things that have happened in their lives together. And basically,
it actually probably, not to interrupt, has one of the most eerie, haunting, inciting incidents of any film I have ever watched.
Yeah.
Alec told me to call this number. He's just died.
Thank you for letting us know.
Should I?
Act normally, carry on as usual. That's all we need from you.
Yeah, it's really good. It's so good. Like, I want to rewatch it.
I do
Just
too.
talking
Like,
about it.
like should I say spoiler, or are we like?
I think
spoiler
everybody
free?
knows the spoiler is that her husband has another wife that she doesn't know
so
about.
like legit,
secretly.
like, her husband passed away, and she and her two sons are both grieving their loss. And it's like one night in her house, she gets like a knock on the door, and she goes to the door, and it's this woman standing there, and she's like,
Have I come to the right house? Alexander Wilson. Yes. You must be his landlady. No, I'm his wife. Mrs. Wilson. I'm Alec's wife.
And it's just so haunting, and it just leads, like, the whole film just escalates from there, and it's one of these movies
There's a lot of plot twists, which we won't reveal, but it's really, really well done. Very suspenseful.
Very, very suspenseful.
The acting is mind-blowing. Ruth Wilson is just, she deserves an Oscar if she hasn't got one already. But the writing, particularly with the timeline, because it begins with in the present day, right? Her husband dies, and now she's starting to learn things about her husband's past through flashbacks. And I don't even know if they're linear flashbacks. I'm not quite sure on that. I think some of them may be...
I'm trying to remember because it was several months ago that I saw it, but...
There are a few
I don't think all of the
yeah.
flashbacks are linear. I think they're actually, some of them are disheveled because
which is so,
the layout
which
of the film.
just adds another layer of how interesting this is because it's done so well. And I think as I've puzzled this out and as we've talked about this, the reason why it flows so well and why it's so engaging is because there is a clear cause and effect for every single flashback. So every time we go into the past, it's because we're basically inside the brain of Mrs. Wilson as we're following her and realizing things with her as she realizes them, remembering things that she's remembering in real time. And I talked about this in my video a while ago about writing flashbacks and how to make flashbacks seem natural, how to write them in a way that doesn't interrupt the flow of the story. And I had actually made that video, I think I made it before I watched this, and then when I watched it, I was like, oh, this is interesting because there's a lot of flashbacks in it. I'm wondering how they're going to pull this off. And I was so impressed because I'm like, there are so many flashbacks. In fact, there are some scenes, I'm thinking of one particular scene where she's standing real time, she's standing in her old apartment that she used to live in with her husband, and she goes over to the window, and she looks out the window, and she has a flashback memory to looking out the window years ago, that same window, and it's like cutting back and forth several times in the same scene, and you would think that would be so jarring. I was thinking about, like, I wonder what, I just want to see this page from the screenplay, because that must have been like so messy looking on the page, but it is absolutely seamless in the actual finished product. And that was just so impressive to me because I'm like, it's hard to pull that off in a way that feels natural. And then how the flashback ends with her closing the curtain. Yeah.
Is like, it was just so spectacularly done.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, that whole film, the way the flashbacks, the act, everything, like, there's not one thing I could say that, like, oh, I think they should have done this differently. Like, literally superb.
It was, absolutely. And it was so... You were never confused or jarred by the flashbacks. And that's what I found so impressive because there were so many flashbacks, but they were never jarring.
Right. And actually, like, when you compare them to, like, you know, Little Women seemed very complicated with how his flashbacks were, even though the flashbacks weren't complicated. They were just flashback. It should have been quite straightforward. But when you think about, like, the context of Mrs. Wilson and the way that story was laid out, there were actually very complicated flashbacks. Like you were saying, the way it cut to them. The way I don't think they were all linear. And then the third element, which I just remembered, is that there's actually flashbacks to the past from other point of views.
Yeah, I was trying to remember that.
When she goes and talks to one of the women,
yes,
and she's sitting in her living room, and the woman who happened to be at the same past event that Ruth Wilson was at herself.
Yeah.
She starts to recount through a flashback. You start seeing flashbacks from her perspective of the same event you saw earlier from Ruth Wilson's perspective.
Yes. That was beautiful.
Like, that was, like, it's hard to even wrap your head around, but it was done in such a way that, like, was seamless. Your brain never stopped to think twice about what was happening because it was quite clear.
Yeah. It was so well done. Very, very artful. And, like I said, it had, like, that flow of cause and effect. That's like, I remember I think it was one of the first flashbacks is when she first starts to look into her husband's past. She goes to a former coworker of his, because he worked in the basically secret intelligence of the government. And she starts talking to him starts talking to his coworker rather, about some something in the past. I can't remember exactly what it was now anymore. But that's the first time we go into her memories because she's like talking about this specific event and then she goes into the memory of it. And I'm like, oh, that was good. That I liked how they pulled that off. And then it kept happening like that. And I'm like, oh, this is so good.
Right. Yeah, that was like extremely well done.
Yeah.
The way those flashbacks were carried out.
Yeah. So kind of to recap, the things that the compare contrast here with Little Women 2020 and Mrs. Wilson, I can't remember, 2019, was that it? I think 2019.
It might have been slightly older than that, but I can't remember.
I can't remember either. But there's only one show called that, so.
Right.
But so the comparison here is that in Little Women, we feel that the flashbacks were delivered in a way that was confusing and disheveled to the point of not helping us care about the characters and not really showing us early on why what's happening in the future matters to these characters because of what happened in the past. Not giving us that yardstick to measure the importance of things by. Not giving us the backstory to show us what matters to these characters and showing them how, and also showing us how they're related, which made for a jarring, kind of detached and disorienting viewing experience. Whereas in Mrs. Wilson, similar sort of genre, there was always a trigger to induce the flashback and show us why what happened in the past is relevant today, and also gives us almost this really close-up, intimate feel of we are in the skin of the character, recollecting things that are important today, but the character didn't even know that they're important. So it's just like these passive memories that she has that she never really used to look at and dig into in a way of like, oh, something happened back then that was important. But now she is remembering those things and realizing like, oh, there was more to that than I first realized. And so it gave us like this really close up, intimate feeling with that character and to feel like we're in the skin of the character, realizing the things that she's realizing in real time. And it just gave more context to the importance of what's happening in the present moment. And we also know why it matters to her, because it matters to her to puzzle out what is going on. Why is there this random woman showing up at my door saying that she's my husband's wife when I'm my husband's wife? And so there's this question right away, something shoving her outside her comfort zone, which gives us context to why her memories matter to her so much and gives us a reason to be interested in the flashbacks.
Right. And we fully understand how everyone's related, why they matter quite quickly, which is a very important thing. And I felt that Little Women 2020 lacked hugely, especially for the fact that it's attracting a pretty young generation that may not have read Little Women, probably hasn't read Little Women, quite a few of them, not all, but quite a few. And perhaps this is the first encounter with Little Women they're having. It was quite confusing as to who everyone was and why they mattered. Again, sort of like the Aeronauts, leaving that to quite later on in the story. Perhaps you've gathered enough information to sort of figure that out and piece it together for yourself.
Right. Whereas
films like Amazing Grace and Mrs. Wilson use the flashbacks and the backstory soon enough and artfully enough to, in a coherent way, to make us realize who everyone is, why everything matters to them, and now we're engaged.
Exactly.
And the same goes for writing books. Like, I mean, do you want to tie that in? Because this is something you're talking about a lot with writing.
Yeah, well, you know, as I always say, a story is a story is a story. So all of these things you can learn from film, you can learn from TV shows, you can learn from books as well. But seeing how, just noticing what really pulls you in, that's, I think, the ultimate lesson here is like, watch different adaptations of things and notice what pulls you in. Notice what makes you emotionally engaged, not just engaged because, oh, it's exciting, it's perilous what's happening on screen right now, but you're engaged because you care about the characters. And notice what that is and when those things appear, particularly like if they appear at the beginning. If they don't, then it's not going to hold your attention for very long, is it? So make notes on these things and watch adaptations of things, and especially books, and really anything. But
Yeah,
I feel like it translates over to books like just as easily.
Books, it's especially interesting to see the different adaptations. Like I said, I mean, watch all the adaptations of Little Women, or read the book and then watch all of them and see like how it was interpreted differently, because that's very interesting. It's a very interesting process to see the different adaptations and how they were taken, and how much artistic views of it will like change the story a lot.
Right. Exactly. 100%.
So if you're a writer watching this, whether you write screenplays or you write books, I think, keep in mind the fact that why the events that are happening, why it matters to your main characters is quite important and quite instrumental in making us care and making us desire to turn the next page or watch the next 10, 20 minutes, hour of the movie. Exactly. That's what carries us through, is to know what the motive is, what's driving the main characters. So that's why backstory can be used as such a beautiful tool to communicate that, if used in a way that is coherent and smooth.
Yeah, 100%. So do you want to add anything to that, or should we move on to our exciting announcement?
Let's move on to the exciting announcement. I think we've said everything that needs to be said. You guys...
If you're still here, you're a true listener.
High five, man. Tell us what you think. Tell us if you've seen any of the films we mentioned, tell us what you think of them, what your takeaways were, things you liked and things you didn't like. Comment, let us know, send us a message. So let's move on to the announcement.
The exciting announcement is, drum roll, the Kate and Abbie Show now has its very own designated Patreon. And the exciting thing about that is we can now have closer access to you guys and also show our love and appreciation for you here on the show. So you're going to go over to the Patreon page and see everything that we have there for you guys. But just as a little teaser, we're going to tell you a little bit about the different tiers that we have here. So if you want to really support the show and you just are like, I want to support these girls, I think they're doing a good job sitting here every week in these uncomfortable wood chairs, telling us cool stuff about stories and about health and creativity and all that good stuff. There is a virtual tip jar where you can leave a little donation for us and show your love and appreciation for the show. If you want to donate a little bit more than that, that tip jar is $2. If you want to donate a little bit more than that and go up to a $5 tier, we will verbally thank you with our own voices here on the podcast and say your name, shout out to you, and thank you very much for your support on the show.
Will it be a metaphorical shout out, or will we actually yell?
We could actually yell if you guys want to turn down your volume a little bit.
Yeah. Otherwise, everyone with earbuds, that's going to be an uncomfortable experience.
Thank you, too. Thank you, too. We're going to thank you guys on the show.
Yeah.
And you can have the pleasure of hearing us say your name and shout out our gratitude to you. And if you want to level up a little bit more and up your donation, not only will we shout you out and not only will you be supporting the show, but you will also have direct access to DM us with your specific recommendations and suggestions and requests for topics for us to cover in the podcast.
Yeah. Because we're always looking for suggestions, and you guys have the best suggestions because you're here watching every week, obviously interested in telling good stories and living a whole, happy, creative life. So we would love to hear what you think, and we would love to be able to seriously consider every single suggestion we get from you guys.
Yeah, so you can DM us with your specific, suggestions and requests if you join the top tier on the Patreon. So go check out all the tiers on the Patreon. I think you're going to love what we have set up over there for you. It is patreon.com/The Kate and Abbie Show. A-N-D, not an and sign, not an ampersand. The Kate and Abbie Show. And the link will be here on the screen as well. If you're watching on YouTube, it'll also be below in the description. And yeah, check it out and see which support level works best for you.
Yeah. Otherwise, thank you so much for supporting us. If you're not able to support on Patreon, no worries. We're so glad that you're here watching the show, supporting us. And every time you guys share and share with us and also share episodes of the show with friends, that is so supportive and helpful to us. And we just want to be able to spread the good vibes and continue this discussion with more and more people about telling stories and how to tell better stories and how to all continue writing, continue chasing our dreams. So thank you for being here. Definitely go check out the Patreon. And we're so grateful for you guys in every sense of the word. Thank you so much.
See you next time.
See you next time. Stay stoked.
And rock on.